I would say that both language and mathematics are reducible to logic.
Brilliant. Would you say that logic and language are products of mind? Now you said Josephus was false. Fine, let's just chuck him in the bin. I'll use Tacitus. Tacitus said that Jesus.
Have you read what he wrote
said,
in the original language? Have you read it?
Crucifix. Oh, now he sounds like the Dawati.
Frederick Engels, Rosa Luxemburg, Karl Marx, they all thought that Jesus Christ should be interpreted as a kind of utopian socialist.
Marxist theory denies the idea of metaphysics. These things are not real, yeah? But Marx said that in a Marxist state, a new kind of humanity would emerge. That's an ontological statement that is based upon metaphysics. Internally contradictory logic. How you doing? What's your name?
Okay, right, as you insist.
We could stick the ladder in the middle, and then you go up and talk, come down, and I go up and talk, and then we know clearly who's meant to be talking.
I think we can distinguish voices and faces.
Fair enough, go on.
I don't really know what to argue. Politics. Politics is another subject, isn't it?
Well, you can talk, so long as it starts from where I finished.
God.
So long as it starts from where I
You
finished.
just don't believe in God, you know. What's your beef with that? If you weren't
You're not starting from where I finished.
If you weren't a believer in God,
Yeah.
how would you explain the world?
If I were not,
Then you were not a believer.
I would explain the world as being the result of random and guided coincidences that have no intrinsic or absolute meaning and is pitiless, merciless, and totally unconcerned, and our natures are just animalistic. But you asked me how I would explain the world if I didn't believe in
There's a
God.
reason why I'm doing that, because generally when I go around and ask people like their views, I'm not trying to like have a go at you. I'm just trying to decipher exactly where you're coming from. So
I can tell you.
There was an element. No, I know where you're coming from, the Bible. But I mean, if you're like me, an atheist or a materialist, or whatever, you might delve beneath. So what I got from what you just said was you have a tremendously negative view of the world and of human beings in general, and that you see your role perhaps as saving them from themselves rather than seeing in themselves. I mean, I've met other people who are Christians who have a different perspective on this, like Lord Soco used to speak here for decades, and he didn't have this negative connotation that you seem to have about the nature of man. Am I wrong in that?
So let me.
Is that just a misquotation?
Let me reply. So, you asked the question, how would I explain the world?
I get that, yeah, but it seemed very negative. Am I wrong?
I allowed you to speak. Yeah, that's why I suggested putting the ladder in. So, I believe as a Christian that actually God does exist. That the world is not meaningless, isn't without value. That it does have value. That there is meaning to our lives.
Why are the two synonymous?
One second.
Why are the two synonymous?
I'm sorry, I didn't interrupt you. You must observe the rules.
There isn't a rule, but anyway.
Okay. This is why I suggested putting the ladder in the middle.
There isn't a rule, but anyway,
This is why I suggested putting the ladder in the middle, and then you said no, we can distinguish with voices and faces, and now you're interrupting. So,
some interruption.
So, brother, so my voice is gone. If you want to hear me, you're gonna have to speak. You're gonna have to move in. So I'll try my best. I'm projecting my voice that way. So what I would say to you is, as a Christian, I believe that human beings have intrinsic dignity that is given to them because they are made in the image of God. And that dignity also means that there is meaning and value to their lives, and that actually the very universe itself witnesses to that reality, the reality of human purpose. And that human beings have this dignity, but that human dignity has been marred by something that we call original sin, which is that this genetically within the human condition there is this desire to turn away from the objective meaning and purpose that God has put into the world, that is to glorify Him and turn towards themselves, to create their own meaning, to be their own gods, to live their own lives according to their own wills, wants and desires. And that this sin has marred human dignity. and that by becoming a follower of Jesus Christ, we recover that dignity, both in a legalistic sense and in an ontological sense.
I mean, it doesn't take away from the negativity of your standpoint. I've met Christians who are not negative about the nature of man. You seem to hold a fundamentally negative view of man without God. So in other words, what I was asking was, if you were not a Christian, I don't know if you became a Christian or if you think you were born one. So before you became a convert to Christianity, did you view mankind negatively? Fundamentally negatively? Because that's what I'm getting from you. You're negative about humanity. And you have to have an external monitor, controller, observer, punisher, man who offers treats, or God who offers treats, to encourage people to behave in a way that you consider glorifies and edifies Jesus and God. I have met Christians, like I said, Lord Soco, for example, who believe in the fundamental goodness of man, and that their goodness manifests itself in the highest forms of, if you like, human activity, music, culture, and so on, which bring us closer in his view. I'm not a believer in God, but bring us closer in his view, now he's dead, to God. Whereas you seem to be implying that people have to bow down and, if you like, recognize how flawed and monstrous they are in order to escape from this, if you like, you know, a hell they're going to go to if they don't choose that path. And that's that if I find is a very negative view of humanity.
Shall I reply?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so firstly, if you want to describe my worldview as negative, I am not troubled by it. I'm quite happy to own it. You can see it however you want. Whatever emotional label you wish to ascribe to my worldview is irrelevant to the question of whether it is true. And that is actually what is more important. Not how we feel about a worldview, but whether a worldview corresponds to reality. That's the important question. Not whether we think it's positive, gooey, gushy, nice, comfortable, negative, disheartening, hopeless. The question is the worldview correspondent to the reality of the world as we experience it? Because however you see my worldview, if it is correct, then you have a moral duty to stand on what is true and to have your worldview correspond to reality as it is, not as we wish it to be. Sorry. There are three ways to measure a worldview. One, is a worldview internally coherent? Does it contradict itself? If I say that A is equal to B and B is equal to C, I have to conclude that A is equal to C. If I say that A is equal not to C, but A is equal to B and B is equal to C, then I've contradicted myself. And that is an incoherent worldview, it is false. Secondly, does my worldview correspond to reality? If I say I am floating here, then I am stating something that does not correspond to reality because I am standing here. So my description of reality is false.
I think your description of reality is false.
Finally, my worldview also has to work. We look at communism. Marxism is a worldview that in every attempt to make it work has failed. It is a worldview that practically doesn't work because it contradicts reality and it's itself incoherent.
I'm gonna try and answer you.
Right, guys, shall we move the cameras? Guys, shall we just move the cameras? You grab your camera, please. I know it isn't. It's COEs. We'll move it. Grab your ladders, come forward. If you want to listen to me and hike in, come over here. I was just moving it for you. Come here, bro. Let's continue our conversation. If they want to argue, if you want to listen to the argument, you can stand there. If you want to listen to the conversation, you can come here.
Right, it's fine. Let's try again. So, the premises you've just made, at least they have a foundation which I can discuss. I do not agree with the fundamental premises you started out as to what constitutes truth.
Can you speak up? I can't hear you.
What constitutes truth, I don't think you're correct on. Truth is not composed of if you like, equivalents of A and A. One and one. That's not what truth's composed of. Truth starts from the acceptance. I know this is a little bit peculiar, but it starts from the acceptance that although one and one is true for the purposes of general orientation in the world, it's not fact. When you said you're not floating, well, you are and you aren't. You are and you aren't. There are, what is floating? Floating means you're not directly connected to the earth, and you aren't. You aren't directly connected. There are molecules of air underneath your feet between you and the earth. You are floating. But for the purposes of specificity, of like generality, we say you're not floating. You're grounded on the earth. But you're not actually grounded on the earth. So one and one is not one, or one doesn't equal one, because you aren't, although you're Bob the Builder, I think, you aren't Bob the Builder. You are and you aren't. Why are you and you are? Because when I say Bob the Builder, it means you now. But when I say Bob the Builder now, it means you now. And they are two different things. Very similar, barely changed, but if we were to accept them as fact, Bob the Builder is always Bob the Builder, then there would be no capacity to understand your birth and your death. Therefore, within a specific time frame and a specific organisation of matter on Earth, you exist as Bob the Builder at this moment, and you are different now from when I said that second ago. So the criteria of truth that you have started out with are mechanistic criteria, and that probably explains some of your, if you like, approach to the world, because you seem to think that there's an absolute truth in God, and that you are manifesting that and reflecting that in what you're saying.
May I reply? So the problem is that the problem that I have with what you've said is that whilst, yes, in terms of the study of physics, the magnetic force between the atoms that make up the ground and the atoms that make up my trainers repel one another enough sufficiently that I don't sink into the earth. So at that level, what you're saying is true. I'm not disputing that. But language is connected to how we describe reality. So when I say I'm standing on the ground,
We know what it is.
exactly. So I'm not
actually
but no,
fact.
hold on. When I'm saying that I'm floating, I'm obviously describing not standing. So if you're describing something as floating, we're not talking at the kind of atomistic level that you're speaking of. We're talking about how we describe our realities. So what I'm saying to you is that if you are saying that my three tests of truth are not a basis for truth, and I admit there are other tests that we can apply, it seems to me that you're denying the idea that there is an objective truth, that there is a relative truth. Or do you believe in an objective truth?
Well, I think you can approximate towards truth.
So is there an objective truth?
Well, there are objective truths. Yep. But these objective truths must, if you want total truth, you will never find total truth about everything. Never. And
That's why. Not my question.
That's why. Well, okay, that's why, in a way, you require God, or many people require God. Well, the point being, there's an argument, for example, that was used against Marxism by a guy called Popper, and what he said was, and I'll put this to you: in your opinion, what is the strongest argument that you can muster against your own views?
Okay, so I have my own criticism, Marxism.
No, your own. Your strongest argument.
One second.
Of your own view.
1 second. I'm going to answer your question because I asked you about objective truth, and you did. You talked. So I'm going to. So because the logic of my argument is that there is an objective truth, and if there is an objective truth, the next question is how do we access it? Now, in terms of your statement, what is the strongest argument that I can apply to my own beliefs?
No, against your own beliefs.
Against my own beliefs.
What would disprove them?
I just want to state though, my criticism of Marxism is the same one of our church father C.S. Lewis, who basically pointed out the myth of Hegelianism, which is entirely what Marxism is built on. The myth of Hegelianism. This idea that with a pathetic amount of information, we can decide the course of history and the way that history is moving. And that is the fundamental folly behind the whole of Marxism is that it is the hubris of man made manifest in the absence of God. Now, in terms of answering your question directly, the strongest argument against my own belief is simply the room for doubt that we have in terms of resurrection. Because whilst I believe that the reasons to believe in the resurrection are strong, I can't prove it 100%. It's outside of that realm of possibility. Precisely because a miracle is supernatural. It's non-reproducible. Can't be replicated. Yeah? So that is the strongest argument against my belief. But I don't believe that that is strong enough to renounce my belief. Now, let me ask you the same question. You're a Marxist, right? Right. As a Marxist, you believe that human civilization has been guided by a dialectic of economy that is going to lead to a Marxist state. Is that correct? Roughly. Right. Based on the fact that the future is non-discernible except by supernatural revelation, on what basis can you argue that the future belongs to a Marxist state?
That's not the Marxist state, but that's by the by.
A Marxist economy. A Marxist economy.
The argument that prediction of the future is a purely, if you like, superstitious concept, I think it's wrong. I think that it is possible to discern from the dynamics existing in society the general direction and trend in which society is moving. Obviously, that the ability to predict and to realise the objectives that you want to achieve is the obvious weakness in Marxism. Is if you are unable to realise those things, at what point does it become an unrealisable dream? And that obviously, well, in my opinion, that is the weakest point. That's where, if you like, because Popper says that, he says that what's the strongest argument against what can disprove your thesis?
Yeah.
So, and you must have that in order for it to be a scientific thesis in the first place.
Popper was arguing against. He was trying to put limits on rationalism and science. He was showing the incoherence.
Trying to show what science.
Trying to define.
Yeah, he was trying to put the boundaries.
You must be able to negate your argument.
Exactly.
Something must negate it.
Exactly.
Otherwise, it's just dream.
Yeah, exactly. But this is what Marx is guilty of.
That's what they say. I'm not disputing they say.
But here's the thing: the evidence supports that. The proletariat revolution has not occurred. Actually, people are fatter, richer, wealthier, and healthier now under a capitalist system than they have ever been in history under any other economic system, including those that claim to be Marxist.
That's another question. I mean, I'm happy to go into that, but that's a general question which I talk about every week. It's not really. We were dealing more with a philosophical standpoint.
It is about the philosophy, though, because bearing in mind my criteria for truth,
which I think are wrong.
Internally coherent, does not contradict reality, and it works. Marxism doesn't work.
I mean, I could just equalise that out without making any effort. But I say, well, Christianity hasn't worked. It doesn't prove anything.
What would be the measure? Sorry, you're wrong there. You're wrong. Because what does Christianity claim to give you?
Salvation. Yeah, salvation.
How can you disprove that
hell
claim?
on earth?
Well, you can't disprove that.
Well, it depends. How can you say that it doesn't
It
work?
also depends on your Christianity.
No evidence that it does work.
No, hold on. The evidence that it does not work is not proof that it doesn't.
Hang on a minute. There is a difference here between
I'll leave you at that.
No, wait.
I'll leave you at that. It's nothing. We've got our lifetimes to jump.
Wait, no. I want to ask you one more question.
On some issues.
I
don't see the point of
Marxist theory denies the idea of metaphysics. These things are not real. Yeah? But Marx said that in a Marxist state, a new kind of humanity would emerge. That's an ontological statement that is based upon metaphysics. Internally contradictory logic.
But Marx was like a gay.
Because Marx studied different societies, and in the different societies, people lived differently, had different morality, had different social organisation, had different sexual relations, and human economic relations. And so that's the foundation upon which Marx justifies his argument that the social conditions in which people live determine the way they live in a consciousness.
Is there a common thing with like humanity? Does it exist?
So what?
Is there such a thing as humanity? Does it exist?
Yes.
That's
It's
an
a particular
ontological
type.
statement. It's a metaphysical statement.
I mean, most people won't know what ontology and
My audience will know what ontology is.
most people won't. But you want to know the foundational belief system and whether it's, if you like, supernatural or grounded in reality. Marxism is quite clearly a materialist philosophy. It's based on the belief that man, in their creation of wealth to satisfy the wants of the mind and the body, shapes society. And society then is shaped by the relations established by those interconnections. And so, for their argument, for Marxist arguments, even religions and social organisation, politics, art, culture are products of specific socio-economic conditions.
But here's the problem. If it is a materialistic worldview, then that means that there is no metaphysics, which means we cannot meaningfully speak of truth. We can't meaningfully speak. Well, I'm going to explain. We can't meaningfully speak of humanity. We can't meaningfully. I'm going to explain. We can't meaningfully speak about the Hegelian dialectic, because the Hegelian dialectic was built on the idea of metaphysics, the idea of the zeitgeist, of the spirit of the age. Truth is a metaphysical claim. If you're saying something is true, then you're making a claim about metaphysics.
I disagree with that. Are you aware of logical positivism?
I think we're wandering off into fields that are not really worth discussing.
Why is a critique of Marxism not worth discussing?
What you're doing is you're raising Hegel up. You're saying Hegel is a metaphysicist. Most people haven't read Hegel, right? I've read a little, but not much.
I've read a little bit of Hegel as well. He's a metaphysicist.
So you're arguing.
Can you prove me wrong?
I mean, there's a mixture in Hegel of Christianity, certainly dominated by a belief in God, but also mixed in with materialism.
So that's metaphysical, right?
And it wanders between the two. It's not strictly metaphysical.
So if Karl Marx is building his prism of history on Hegel's
he's arguing on
metaphysics,
the foundation of the critique of
Marx also built on Feuerbach.
criticizes Hegel as the foundation for his theoretical system, or his theoretical belief system.
would you accept that every Marxist society we've ever tried to have has failed?
Well, because it's a materialist philosophy, it analyses the formations which have been created, which call themselves Marxist states, or Marxist governments, or communist governments, with the same analytical perspective. So just the same as, for example, a born-again Christian looks at the belief system of the Catholic Church as, if you like, alien to a pathway to God. So Marxists analyse, it's not quite the same, but at least there's a parallel. Marxists like myself analyse the systems that claim to be communist from the perspective of the method applied by Marx. In other words, we look at the material conditions and how they shape the social relations of society. We look at the external environment within which this took place and analyse what happened to that society. And then we draw up a new critique of those societies and where they can go, based upon using the method developed by Marx, which was developed before those states came into existence. And I believe that method is still valid as the best method to understand states that claim to be communist states. So just the same as there have been various states that have claimed to be Christian states, which you may well disagree with.
So, I mean, I know you're wanting
It's not quite the same, but it's very similar.
I know you're wanting to go, but I would leave you with this thought. The church survived every attempt to create communism, but communism itself has never, a communist state has never survived. The church that was founded by Jesus Christ
A quarter of the world lives under the Chinese government.
has survived for 2,000 years. Communism in China is already dead. They're a
that's an
capitalist
argument.
economy.
We can have an argument about that.
They're
I
an
don't think that's
authoritarian party, but a capitalist economy.
I don't think that's a correct argument.
Right. So, but my point is to you, is that the church has survived for 2,000 years. So Jesus is clearly onto something. Marx is not. So who's the better teacher? Jesus the Christ or Karl Marx?
Well, what do you mean by Jesus? There are many different Jesuses.
There's only
Jesus
one Christ.
depends on your interpretation.
I'm sorry, can you show what Christian group has a different interpretation?
Was Jesus a socialist?
Was Jesus a
Taking
socialist?
it from another perspective. In other words, outside of
Jesus was not a socialist.
well then,
He was a theocrat.
why give up your wealth and share it out?
He was a theocrat.
Why give up your wealth and share it out?
But that's voluntary. And it's only amongst those that
It's
want
certainly,
to.
you'd find a lot of quotations from Jesus Christ, which are citations basically, but a lot of citations from Jesus Christ, which, you know, they wouldn't be amiss with Jeremy Corbyn, would they?
Sure. Fine. Let's look at them. Can you show me one?
Matthew.
I'm not I mean, you know them yourself. You don't require me.
Yeah.
Camel through the eye of a needle, you know, give up your sword.
Did Karl Marx say that people go to heaven?
Of course he didn't say that, but
So that's not what Jesus is teaching.
no, that's not what I said. I said, was Jesus a socialist?
And the answer is obviously no.
It's not obviously not.
Of course it is.
Because there are many examples within the Bible
Yeah.
of Jesus advocating things and doing things
Yes.
which in modern times, or certainly in the last 2,000 years, when the concept of socialism has emerged, you could draw parallels, and many people drew on Christianity as the root source for the philosophy of their interpretation of Christianity as a socialist doctrine. And
Except that socialism.
it's not quite as simple
So
as
the
you're claiming.
idea that Christ was a socialist is totally fallacious. Christ was a theocrat who believed
Doesn't mean he's not a
he was
socialist.
he was a theocrat who believed that he was the Messiah. The very verse
He
that
was
you're
the
talking
Messiah,
about-
wasn't he?
He was, of course.
Sorry.
Yeah, I'm speaking as a
cheat
historian.
point, sorry.
Yeah, of course it is.
That was
But
a bit,
I'm
yeah.
speaking as a historian. Jesus Christ believed himself to be the Messiah. His followers believed that he was the Messiah. Right? That is a profoundly theocratic worldview. That is the essence of it. Because the Messiah is meant to rule.
That doesn't per se contradict the idea that he could be some kind of theocratic socialist, does it?
Right. So hold on. Socialism.
When everything was theocratic at one time, wasn't it?
Socialism doesn't believe in theocracies.
Well, no, you're talking about modern socialism. You're not talking about historical socialism.
No, I'm sorry.
Frederick Engels, Rosa Luxemburg,
Yeah.
Karl Marx, they all thought that Jesus Christ should be interpreted as a kind of utopian socialist.
But the question is not
And
whether
and there's a very good book on the subject.
There's not whether-
Kautsky's book,
Yeah.
The Foundations of Christianity,
But the
which
thing
goes
is-
into detail, analysing all the texts in the Bible that Jesus states, all the statements Jesus makes, which could be interpreted, and his actions.
But that's
Which include-
historicism.
Well, it's applying dialectical materialism, in other words, an analysis of the material conditions at the time,
Yep.
and the type of social relations at
Yep.
the time, and viewing what Jesus then represented within that context.
Yep.
And he
that's
represented.
historicism. What is historicism?
I mean, you're just throwing terms that sound clever.
No,
I've
shall I
got a
tell-
PhD.
no, hold on. What
I
is
don't have a
historicism?
problem discussing in this type of
What is
language,
historicism?
but it's not what I do at Speakers.
What is historicism?
It's a method to look, I mean, as far as I understand, a method to look at society purely from historical viewpoint.
No.
Analysing historical methods.
No. Historicism is not the study of history.
So what are you saying?
Historicism.
Say what it is that are wasting your
Historicism is the mythologizing of history.
Why is it mythologizing?
Because
I said they're using material methods
they are not
to
looking
analyse the
at like a
conditions of
historian.
time.
An historian.
Talking about.
An historian looks at the evidence. He sees
Evidence of what?
I'm going to answer. So he looks at. Let's look at whether Jesus was a socialist. Let's use that as our
Evidence
example.
of what?
So I'm giving you an example. I am literally going to answer
what
your
you're talking about.
question.
You throw historicism.
I'm literally going to answer your question. So how do we do history? We have facts that we get from history because of records. We're going to use the example of whether Jesus was a
But
socialist.
what facts do you use?
So we're going to use the example of Jesus'
We're going to go nowhere with this.
No, we are.
I'll tell you why.
But you're just. Why is it? I asked you a simple question. We can collect all the facts. We can collect all the facts that are pertinent to the question, and we will still come to the conclusion that Jesus was not a socialist. I will have a debate with you, ladder on ladder. You can do it next week. You can prepare all your evidence, and we'll see if Jesus. I'm challenging you right now.
We won't be able to answer that question.
And I'm
we
challenging
won't be able
you
to clarify
debate.
what his views are.
I'm
we won't be able to
challenging you
answer
to a debate.
Sorry?
I'm challenging you to a debate. Was Jesus a socialist? Let's debate it next week.
I don't mind debating it one day, maybe not next week. Just debate it. I'd have to go back to some research. You obviously know your Bible. And I'd have to know the bits in the Bible. You're going to throw bits in the Bible at me and try and catch me out.
But
so
that's
I'd,
what
I'd have to have
that's
them.
the
I'd have
point.
to have them in order
That's
to
the
be able
point
to do
of
that.
real history.
No, it's not the point of real history.
The point of real history is that you look at all the facts and then you draw your conclusion.
Well,
Historicism is you only look at the facts that support your view.
Whose
How do you
history
look
are we
at all
talking
the
about?
facts?
Whose history is real history?
Exactly. We're talking about the history of Jesus Christ.
So is there
we've got to
dogma?
look at the evidence that we have about Jesus.
Okay, fine.
Where do we find that
None
evidence?
of that
If you
evidence.
look at the history-
None of that evidence. Not a single word.
He's gonna
of what's
hang
written
himself
in the
now. Go
Bible.
on.
Not a single word written in the Bible was written at the time when Jesus was alive.
Brilliant. So
Not
how
a
can
word.
you say he was a socialist?
Not a word.
So how can you say he was a socialist?
He was the mythology within the masses of someone who would act as a saviour of them from Roman enslavement.
So Jesus wasn't even a real person now.
He may or may not have been.
I
You may
think
or
it
may
was
not
a
have
He may
rabbi,
have been a
Yehoshua.
combination
So,
of
so the
two.
fact of the
He
matter
may
is,
have been a myth, he may have been a real
there you
person.
go.
We don't
So this
know.
is what I mean.
There's no evidence
Look what
to
you've
show he
just done.
existed.
You made a claim Jesus was a socialist. You were certain
Yes,
about
the
it
character of
5
Jesus
minutes
is social.
ago.
No, I didn't say.
You
I
5
never
minutes
said I was
ago,
certain
you
that
were
Jesus-
certain
you didn't ask
Jesus
me
was a
about that.
socialist.
I said
And
because
then
he
when we
represents
pushed
the
on your
idea.
argument, suddenly Jesus is now a
Correct.
myth.
That's not correct.
This
What
is
I said,
not- that's
I
what
said
I'm
to
saying.
you a second ago,
That's historicism.
I do not know if he existed or not, nor do you.
Yes, we do.
You believe he existed.
He is the
on the
most
basis of that book.
attested.
You do
No,
not have any
not just on-
evidence.
no,
he existed,
yes, I do.
Because not
I
a
have
sing-
independent
not
evidence.
A single word of that book
Josephus
was
says
written.
that Jesus existed.
Josephus
Suetonius
has been
said
shown.
that Jesus
Josephus
existed.
as I recommend
Tacitus
you.
said that Jesus existed. Julius Africanus said that Jesus
The problem is-
existed.
the problem
Pliny
is
the
if you
Younger
actually
said
look-
that Jesus
if you
existed.
actually look-
Celsus said that Jesus
You're
existed.
claiming these things, and you obviously haven't done the background research.
No, you clearly
to
haven't.
justify your argument.
You clearly haven't.
Because those those people you are citing.
You just said the only evidence that we have about Jesus was in the New Testament. I've just given you Jewish
They are not actually
and
evidence.
pagan
They are not
and
evidence.
Christian historians
If you
who
look at-
all demonstrate Christ really
don't
existed.
demonstrate.
He is
They
the most
they
attested
name-
person to from antiquity.
Are you talking about Flavius Josephus, the Jewish
I'm
one?
sorry.
His book on right, okay.
You obviously haven't gone back and looked at those actual texts and then checked up what they were in the ancient Greek. Because these words, Jesus as Saviour, almost every single name used at that time meant Saviour, salvation, something like that. And a lot of those people, like Josephus, for example, has been shown to be forgery, a lot of the material.
Actually, this is
The
what-
actual contemporary
actually-
witnesses who
actually-
are cited in the Bible are not
Actually,
Josephus
let's just-
and
I'm sorry,
Tacitus.
I'm sorry.
They are Matthew,
No, I'm
Mark,
sorry,
and others.
I'm sorry.
First
Your
scriptures
claim-
written by contemporary.
Your
written
claim
by those
was that
who are the
everything
first-
we know about Jesus was in the New Testament. I have
say
given
that.
you
I didn't say that.
examples
It's falsifying what I'm
outside
saying.
of the New Testament
But I'm
that
challenging
speak
those
about
examples.
Jesus as a real person.
challenging those
Now you
examples.
said
They do
Josephus
not
was
pro-
false.
firstly-
Fine, let's just chuck him in the bin. I'll use Tacitus. Tacitus
Have
said
you read
that Jesus.
Tacitus? Have you read what he wrote?
Tacitus said
In the original
Tacitus
language?
said,
Have you read it?
Crucify.
Have you
Oh,
read
now
it?
he sounds like the Dawa team.
No,
Have you read it in the original language?
Because
Scholars have
Why
translated
are you
it, bro.
relying- Why are you relying upon
Tacitus
these
says.
things? Why are
Tacitus
you
says
relying upon these
Jesus Christ
Romans and
was
Jews? Why are you relying
crucified
upon them?
under Pontius Pilate
Was he
in
crucified?
the reign of
In
Tiberius.
the Bible it doesn't say he was crucified.
Every source that we
One
have
part says
about
he hung
Jesus.
from a tree.
Oh,
Another says he was
now
crucified.
says that Jesus wasn't.
Is there a
Which-
citation in the Bible saying he was hung from a tree?
Which gospel says that he wasn't
I don't
crucified?
know, you tell me. I mean,
Which-
I know
which
for a fact
gospel
that in
says
the
that he wasn't
Bible,
crucified?
it's not just said that he was crucified.
Yes.
It's also said that he was
Yes.
hung from a tree.
Yes, and when you
Is that
nail
correct or
someone
not?
to a
Is
cross,
that correct or not?
can you not describe the cross as a metaphor and call it a tree? And are you
because
not
you're
hanging?
choosing,
If I hang a
you're
picture on a
choosing to
wall by a
ignore the
nail,
contradictory evidence.
if I hang a
You're
picture,
choosing to
it's not
ignore the
contradiction.
contradictory evidence.
What you're being.
One says he was
No,
hung from a tree,
no, you're
another
just
says he was
being-
crucified.
You don't
But
allow
you're
for
insisting
idioms of
that he was
language.
crucified.
If I say I'm going to be with you in a minute, does it say I'm going to be with you in exactly 60 seconds?
It's not quite the same thing as whether
No,
he's hung.
it's an
whether he's
idiom.
hung or
If
whether
you
he's
say that
crucified.
Jesus hung from a tree, everyone would have understood that Christ was crucified.
So there is contradictory evidence you don't deny.
contradictory.
You're just saying you can explain
It's just
it,
an
but you're
idiom of
accepting.
language.
You're accepting there
just
is a
an
contradiction
idiom of language.
in the Bible,
You want
even
to
about that
force-
fundamental question
you
as
want
to whether
to
Jesus was
force a
crucified
literal
or hung from a
interpretation.
tree. You've accepted there are statements.
So
in that-
we've got-
I don't know who said it.
we've got
Is it Matthew who
witnesses
said it? Who said it?
from the New
Who said it?
Testament.
Who said he's hung from a
Paul.
tree?
Paul.
So Paul, who was a contemporary of
Yeah.
Jesus supposedly, said he
Yes.
was hung from a tree.
Yes, he was
Another
alive when
guy
Jesus
says
was alive.
he was crucified.
And he became a
So in other
Christian.
words, I
You've
don't
got to answer
care
the
whether he was
question why.
crucified or hung from a tree.
Did Jesus
I don't care
live?
whether he existed or not.
Did Jesus
I
live?
think he was a mythical character.
A mythical character.
Who may or
Yeah, I
may not have
disagree.
I
existed.
think that Jesus
He
was
may
a rabbi
or may
called
not have
Yahweh,
existed.
who claimed
The
All the
point
evidence
is that
contradicts
his
you.
role.
You're asserting something that the evidence contradicts. That's Marxism all
the
over.
evidence isn't there.
That's Marxism. It
The
says the
evidence
evidence
isn't
is
there.
not there.
You're
Paul
claiming
wrote
the
about
evidence.
Jesus.
Sorry?
Luke wrote about
But
Jesus.
none of them wrote
John
at the
wrote
time.
about
The
Jesus.
first writing about
Mark
Jesus
wrote about
was
Jesus.
30 years after he died.
Josephus wrote about Jesus.
Right in the Bible,
Suetonius wrote
30
about
years
Jesus.
after he died, am I right or not?
Tacitus wrote about
30
Jesus.
years afterwards.
How many people need to write about Jesus before you believe Jesus was written? Do you believe Julius Caesar existed?
Julius Caesar we know existed.
Why?
Because there is considerable evidence that he existed.
No,
Considerable.
there are less documents and less witnesses to the life of Julius Caesar than there are to Jesus Christ.
We'll leave it at that.
No.
The point being that
You
your
don't know
own
your
book,
history.
I was saying your own book does
There
not.
are less sources and less witnesses to the life of Julius
Okay, let me ask you
Caesar
this.
than there are to the life of Jesus Christ.
I'm sorry. I'll go back and check on the Julius
Yeah,
Caesar.
please.
I doubt that very
Please.
much. I
Please.
doubt that very much. But the evidence presented in the Bible, not by Josephus and Tacitus.
Why don't you want
but
to
in
use
the Bi-
Josephus or Tacitus?
Because they are heathens, aren't they?
I've got no problem with heathen witness.
But why haven't you got actual witnesses from your own
We do
creed?
have actual witnesses.
You don't.
We do have actual witnesses.
But when were they written? When were they written?
So I'll
the
give you
first
one.
writing in the Bible about Jesus was 30 years after his death.
Wrong.
30.
Wrong.
I believe it's Matthew.
You're just wrong. Plain wrong.
Or when was it?
It's 10.
10 years. Okay, well, we'll check that again.
Yeah.
Okay, thanks very much, yeah? Cheers.
Okay.
Another day.
He's-
So,
No, it's enough.
ask you a very
enough.
quick question.
Yes.
I just want to discuss your concept of truth.
Lovely. Yeah.
It seems to me that there is an epistemological concept of truth,
Yeah.
which we can know from evidential, which is all we as human beings can ever know.
Yeah.
And then there is an eschatological concept of truth, which seems to be the one that you hold. Now, I would speak as a logical positivist. So I just want to posit this question to you. In any possible universe, however it can be designed, by whatever possible supreme being, 1 plus 1 must always equal 2. That is a certain truth which exists independent of any divine being or any supernatural force. Agree or disagree?
No, I think it has to be founded on a more fundamental basis of reality. I agree with you that 1 plus 1 will always equal 2. Yeah? However, what you've just done is given evidence for metaphysics. And metaphysics is the beginning of the supernatural. Because you've just spoken about concepts, about numbers, about and bearing in mind that this language that we use is somehow like a magic code by which we can describe reality to the most incomprehensible levels of accuracy. And for me, this is actually an evidence that there is something more than the material, something more than simply a material world. It gives room for the supernatural.
Okay. I distinguish between the supernatural and the abstract. When as a Platonist, I believe that numbers exist outside of space and time.
I have sympathy for that perspective, but I haven't quite made my own mind up yet. Fair enough.
Okay, because I think otherwise, if you say that numbers did not exist outside of space and time, then it would be possible for a universe to exist where 1 + 1 equals 3, which would be a total logical contradiction. So, do you believe that God is logic?
No, I don't believe that God can be reduced to logic. I think that God is the foundation upon which truth emerges.
So you think it's the other way round? Logic comes from God.
Logic comes from God.
So what grounds God?
God needs neither grounds. He doesn't have need. He is totally sufficient within himself.
Okay, right.
And he's not built on anything else. He is literally the lowest foundation that you can get to, and there is no lower. Because his foundation just goes on. So there's nothing deeper than God. Logic emerges from it, and therefore numbers emerge, rationality emerges from it. And to me, as someone who has accepted the reality of metaphysical objects, like numbers, if you can accept the reality of metaphysical objects like numbers, why is the idea of a metaphysical being something that you have a problem with?
Well, actually, I'm a logical positivist. So the ground of logical positivism is the rejection of metaphysics.
Well, that's internally incoherent because you just accepted the idea of metaphysical objects like numbers.
No, a number is not a metaphysical object. Sorry, object. It is an actual ground of being.
You're saying that numbers are that the whole of reality is based on numbers.
Exactly.
That is an interesting theory. So that would mean that they have no personality?
Correct.
That would mean that there would be no order to what they do.
Their only order is in their integers. Dedekin's postulate that between any series of integers there lies infinity. The postulate So within any order of numbers, that is internally coherent within itself, but only of itself.
But there's no morality.
No morality.
Right.
No.
So there's nothing wrong with me killing you or you killing me.
I would like it if you did, but on epistemologically, I couldn't criticise you for it.
Right. But you would agree that everything in you tells you that that's wrong.
Well, yes, obviously I wouldn't like you to kill me.
But you would also agree that everything in you emerges from the reality of numbers.
I would say that my mental state is entirely dependent on my neurological state, and my neurological state can be arithmetically and numerologically described.
Right. So I'll pause. But what you're saying is all of this is emerging from numbers.
It doesn't emerge from numbers because there's nothing actually to emerge from. There's no physical reality.
Where did the material where did the material come from?
No, the numbers actually describe.
I know they describe, but you're saying that the grounding of reality is numbers.
Correct.
Right?
Yeah.
Now, as a language that the universe is clearly coded, and we have tapped into that code through mathematics.
Correct.
That's why we can do the most amazing things.
Correct.
Like with a hadron collider and stuff like that.
Precisely, yeah.
Right? I am fully on board with the idea of science. I've got no problem with it at all. But what it seems to me you're saying, and I agree with you, that code of mathematics allows us to describe the universe. Got no argument with it. We're on the same page.
Okay, right.
But where does it come from? The material.
Right. I personally, and many people would dispute this, I know, I personally believe in the uncaused cause.
The uncaused cause.
In the Aristotelian ethics.
And that is exactly as Christians believe, and this uncaused cause we call God.
Okay, fair enough. Right. That's a very interesting argument, and to be honest, there's no way I can possibly refute that.
Because you agree with it?
Because I don't have the evidence to do it.
So me and you are on the same page about mathematics being a code that describes reality.
Right, yeah.
To a measurable, unreasonable. Would you agree that it's unreasonable how amazingly accurate mathematics is in describing the physical universe?
It's not unreasonable how accurate it is. It can't be anything else than accurate.
But it's
you could not have an inaccurate mathematics.
Its powers of description
it would contradict itself.
belie the idea that we just invented it.
No, we didn't invent it.
Exactly, that's my point.
We discovered it.
Exactly, that's my point. Would you agree that it's language?
I would say that both language and mathematics are reducible to logic.
Brilliant. Would you say that logic and language are products of mind?
Are they reducible?
Products of mind.
Right. To be honest with you, if I'm going to be consistent in my beliefs, I would have to say no.
No.
Because I would say that even if planet Earth did not exist, that no humans existed, even if the universe had never existed, numbers would still exist.
Right. So that if there is no material world, you're saying numbers exist.
Yeah.
So now we go back to something that I tried to draw out from you earlier.
Right.
If I killed you, that would be wrong, right?
It would be wrong by the definition of a certain society.
No, what I mean
at
is,
a particular
everything
point in time.
everything in you says don't kill me, that would be wrong. You've got no logic for it, but everything in you tells you that.
I don't know what this thing in me is.
Right, but it still tells you I shouldn't kill you, right?
I obviously don't want you to kill me. No.
Right, so, but what you're saying is that emerges from numbers. Because you're saying if the whole material world didn't exist, numbers would still exist. But the whole material world does exist, and therefore you exist. And you do have this experience that says, I shouldn't kill you. So at bottom, those numbers have given you that desire.
But can I ground truth upon my own personal experience? For all I know, you might be a phantom of my imagination.
Right, but here's my point. If you're saying that numbers give rise to the material, and therefore give rise to you, and therefore give rise to your idea of don't kill me, then that means there has been movement within the material from the numbers towards purpose. Do you see my logic?
I do, yes.
Would you agree that purpose is a product of mind?
Yes.
Right. So if numbers have purpose, they have mind. If they have mind and they're uncaused, so we've got an uncaused cause that has a mind, that you're calling numbers and I'm calling God. The wasps, I'm attractive even to wasps. Yeah? Would you see my logic?
I do, yes.
We're calling the same thing by different terms.
Okay, it seems to me that you're talking rather about John Polkinghorne's cosmological arguments.
Well, that's part of it.
Yeah.
But it's also the idea of necessary being and contingent being.
Okay, right, yes, exactly.
Because we agree that at base there is something that is a necessary being. You're calling that numbers, and I'm calling that God.
Okay, you're interpreting the idea of numbers as being being. I would disagree with that. I do not think that numbers are ontological in any sense or form.
So in what way do they
they're
exist?
Logical. They exist outside of space and time.
Yes, but that's a being.
No.
That is
not.
That is an existence, isn't it?
No.
It's not an existence.
No, it's not ontological in any way whatsoever.
Now, I think that your worldview is collapsing into sophism.
Ah, okay.
Because you're saying that numbers would exist independent of anything else.
Yes.
That's necessary.
Correct.
But if they exist, that's being. So that's necessary being.
No, because you can exist without being in a total abstract sense.
But that's sophism, because you're saying existence is something that exists there.
Not necessarily, no.
But this is
because you're talking about abstract existence or physical existence.
I'm talking about real existence, whether it's not physical. I accept it's not physical. I'm not talking about material existence.
Everything that exists has to have an ontological ground of being.
I'm saying that if something necessarily exists, it exists.
Which you would describe as God.
And therefore it has being.
That's a very Thomistic argument.
It is, surprisingly. I'm alright with that.
I'm amazed at that. I wouldn't have thought you were a Thomist.
Yeah, so my point is to you, we've both identified, right, the idea of a necessary being to all of the things, that is an uncaused cause, that has mind, because it demonstrates mind through purpose.
Okay, correct.
So there's a teleology.
Right, so towards a final cause.
Yeah, our lives move
Aristotle,
towards a
yeah.
final cause, and therefore the thing that gives rise to that final cause has demonstrated purpose,
Yeah.
and therefore it has mind. So, bro, why don't you just believe in God? Because, I mean, don't be proud in your heart.
Yeah, mate, yeah.
Don't be proud in your heart. If the logic of our argument leads us to God, we should fear not to go there.
Right, yeah.
If the promised land is on the other side of the lake,
Yeah.
and the boat is sufficient to get us to the other side, let us complete the journey.
Okay, fair enough. Anyway, very nice to talk to you. Sorry, can I ask, did you study philosophy or theology?
I studied philosophy at university.
Right, okay, right.
And I studied religion.
You have a very
And I
sophisticated
studied
format.
physics.
Right, yeah. I mean, I did philosophy and maths at UCL and then went on to statistical genetics as well.
Have you got a Bible?
I haven't, no.
Yeah.
But anyway, it was very
I'd
nice
like to give
talk
you.
Oh,
No, I'm giving it you as a gift.
Oh, well,
You've been a pleasant guy. Please
Yeah.
accept it as a gift. Please read it.
I will do, yeah.
New Testament, start in the New Testament. But I would just encourage you that if you can see the logic of our argument leads us to God,
Right.
don't hold back from going there.
Yeah.
Because when you accept that reality, there'll be other questions that emerge
Okay,
that
yeah.
you must then follow with the same integrity.
Right, of course, yeah.
If the promised land is on the other side of the lake and the boat is enough to get you there, complete the journey. You already believe in an uncaused cause that has necessary being, that has mind.
Well, I'm certainly not a Marxist like Heiko.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
Anyway,
it's
really
very
nice
nice
to
to
speak
talk
to
to
you.
you. Take care, my friend.
God bless.
Yeah.
Bye-bye.
Thank you. Yeah.
So I ended up talking with Heiko, who wanted to jump on the back of a conversation, a preach, I guess, that I was giving about the reality of the resurrection. And Heiko demonstrates immediately the falsity of Marxism, because Marxism is a self-contradictory ideology that claims that metaphysics is false while premising itself upon the existence of metaphysics. It believes that it can identify the true course of history, leading to a Marxist state. That is a truth claim based upon a Hegelian dialectic. And if someone is making a truth claim based upon a Hegelian dialectic, they are appealing to metaphysics. If then they are saying, on the other hand, metaphysics don't exist, then that is the equivalent of saying that A is equal to B is equal to C, but A is not equal to C. It's self-contradictory. He also acknowledges that Marxism hasn't worked. There is no communist state. It has never worked, so it fails. And it also contradicts reality because it works from, and it is a point that I didn't get to explore with him, which is that he was arguing that Marxism would lead to a communist man, a new way of being human. However, that is based upon the idea of a metaphysical reality, that human beings can change by the construct of their societies. And I accept this is one truth about communism that is fair, that the way our economy works forms human nature. But human nature is always inherently sinful, regardless of what society you put around human nature. We will always lie, we will always steal, we will always kill, we will always dishonor our parents, we will always break the law of God, which is to love God and our neighbor as ourselves. Why? Because our nature is sinful. And Marxism doesn't believe that. And that is why Marxism fails. Because it believes that human beings are a blank sheet of paper. I leave it to you.
Thank you, Bob. Blessings.